So welcome to this evening's Alborada online event. My name is Pablo Navarrete. I'm a co-editor of Alborada. My colleague Nick is with us behind the scenes, trying to make sure that everything runs as smoothly as possible. Although 5 minutes ago, his Zoom crashed. So hopefully that's not a sign of things to come. So welcome all. Sorry for those that joined us at 7 that you were subjected to that picture of Boris Johnson and Jair Bolsonaro for half an hour. I hope that wasn't too painful. But we're here to discuss UK government foreign policy towards Latin America. I should say that we are live streaming to our YouTube page, and we are recording, and we're going to be sharing. It will be archived on our YouTube page, and we'll also be sharing a kind of edited version on our social media. So before I introduce our two fantastic speakers, just to say thank you to those that bought tickets for this evening, to the organizations that have supported the event, specifically Brazil Wire. I know John has written for them. I see Natalia is in the audience, in the virtual audience, Brazil Wire journalist who's spoken at previous events. Venezuela Analysis, which Rachel forms part of the editorial collective, as well as being a contributing editor for Alborada, and also Wipalas Around the World, a UK-based Brazilian activist group. And the three of us, alongside Alborada, the four of us, form part of The Wire, a service by the Progressive International, kind of new internationalist think tank. Hopefully, Nick can share some of the links to these independent media outlets and to the Progressive International, all doing our bit to sort of challenge some of the mainstream narratives. And that's, most of you should know, but Alborada was set up with particularly that purpose in mind, to sort of challenge a lot of the mainstream narratives on Latin American politics, media, and culture. So we are recording. The idea is that we have an hour, just under an hour now. I have Rachel Boothroyd, as I said, with me, who's going to be co-chairing. And the idea is that we'll just have a kind of half-hour chat with Matt and John, and then open up to the questions. So do feel free to put the questions in the chat section from any point that you feel that you want to ask them, and then we'll try and get to them from about 8 o'clock onwards. So the two speakers we have, Matt Kennard and John McAvoy, are two of the foremost writers, researchers, analysts on writing about UK foreign policy, and specifically in relation to Latin America. John McAvoy is a PhD researcher, a journalist for Brazil Wire and others, who's written for Alborada, and really I would say the foremost writer on exposing UK government dodginess, shall we say, around Latin America. And alongside we have Matt Kennard, a brilliant investigative journalist, head of investigations at Declassified UK, a relatively new independent media outlet, which Matt can perhaps tell you more about later, and who has extensive experience writing about issues related to Latin America. He's written 2 books, Irregular Army and The Racket, and he has another one forthcoming in 2022, I believe. So, as I said, we have an hour. I'm going to now hand over to Rachel to get things going, and then hopefully we'll get as many questions and debate, as much debate as possible going. So over to you, Rachel.
Cheers, Pablo. Thanks. Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Pablo said and thank both John and Matt for being with us this evening. They've been doing incredibly important work documenting UK foreign policy towards Latin America, which can be overlooked. We do have potentially a lot to get through this evening. So John, I'm just going to jump straight in with you, if that's okay. You've reported a lot on 20th century UK foreign policy towards Latin America, focusing quite a lot on the 60s and 70s. So I was just wondering, I know it's quite broad, but could you give us an overview of some of your research there? And it might be good as well if you could comment on what led you to start looking at that time period as well.
Yeah, sure. Cheers, Rachel, and cheers for the introduction as well, Pablo. And Yeah, it's really good to be here alongside Matt as well. Who's definitely one of the best journalists in the country at the moment, especially in regards to UK foreign policy. Yeah, so what I want to talk about today really is, I mean, usually in these things we've been speaking about very much contemporary British foreign policy in Latin America. I mean, what's been going on with Bolsonaro, or what's been happening in Venezuela recently. And obviously there's an issue with media reporting on what's been happening recently. And generally how little is written about such recent British foreign policy in Latin America. And I think one of the reasons why this kind of area is neglected so much within the media is because there's very little kind of historical context to be given about what's happened, especially in the post-World War II period. I mean, a lot of scholars, Rory Miller, who's also based in Liverpool, for example, have written about the kind of era of informal imperialism in Latin America, which was, following the wars of independence in the 1810s, 1820s, going up until the end of the First World War. So throughout the 1800s, Britain had kind of significant commercial interests in Latin America, especially in the Southern Cone, in Chile and in Argentina. And coming up to even to the end of World War One, Britain still had significant commercial interests to the degree that it's still generally analysed as a period of informal empire. However, when you get to the post World War II period, obviously Britain's empire is in massive decline. Latin America is generally written about in Foreign Office reports as an area of outer interest. Basically, it's deprioritized altogether. It's not given much. It's generally seen to not be given much attention by the British Foreign Office at all. And I mean, in the post World War II period in general, there's kind of a cutoff point right there, especially in terms of histories of British foreign policy in Latin America, as if nothing between kind of now and then occurred whatsoever. And one of the reasons for this is secrecy in general. The declassification process has been somewhat ridiculous with regards to what's been happening in Latin America. So files like written even in the late 1950s are only just being declassified now. So yeah, I mean, what the main thrust of what I want to talk about today is kind of British covert foreign policy in Latin America in the post-World War II period. So in 1959, of course, you have the Cuban Revolution, and that kind of really changes the British Foreign Office's perspective of Latin America. It kind of replaces it on the map of sorts. And I mean, even domestically, I mean, they wrote the Parry Report afterwards, which reignited interest in Latin America. Because basically, in response to the Cuban Revolution, the Foreign Office basically wasn't sure what to do, and there was a dearth of expertise about the region in general. So there was kind of an attempt to reignite interest in the region, get it as a subject in universities once again. But the main thing that happened really is that there was a secret propaganda unit within the Foreign Office called the Information Research Department, and that had been active all over the world. I mean, especially in Europe, especially in the Middle East as well, in the areas of major commercial interest. However, it also started operating to a really significant degree in Latin America. So yeah, I mean, the main trigger for them going into Latin America was the Cuban Revolution. And one of the first countries that gets kind of targeted in a significant way is Cuba itself. So in 1961, the US cuts off diplomatic relations with Cuba. Obviously, as is well known, the US continued covert activity through Operation Mongoose, Operation Northwoods, which was basically trying to create a justification to intervene militarily in Cuba by launching terrorist campaigns on US land. Obviously, that didn't go through in the end, but there were plans. There were plans being drawn up by the US foreign policy apparatus. But as the US is kind of forced out openly from Cuba, Britain becomes its eyes and ears. Britain hadn't severed diplomatic relations altogether with Cuba. So, I mean, the British foreign policy, and especially the IRD, start talking about helping out our friends in Washington. So they're sending information, they're sending intelligence, but they're also cooperating on covert propaganda operations. And one of Britain's own actual propaganda operations in an attempt to delegitimize the Castro government was it plotted to spread rumors about about Castro's brother, Raul Castro, that he was homosexual. Later on, the British Foreign Office was also trying to delegitimize Cuba's operations in Angola and across Africa when it was kind of supporting national liberation movements. So it was forging fake documents in an attempt to kind of destroy morale amongst the MPLA in Angola. And another thing that kind of triggered the Foreign Office's interest in Latin America in this period was the kind of rise of popularity of Salvador Allende in Chile during the early 1960s. And obviously Allende, as many of you will know, ended up being elected in 1970. Still remains a popular figure among the left in Latin America. And in Chile, the IRD was up to basically similar operations. It was distributing material, especially in 1964 for the 1964 general election. It was distributing material designed to promote Eduardo Frei, his opponent, and also to delegitimize Allende. And by the 1970s, the IRD is really kind of up in its operations in Latin America in general. So to read verbatim from an IRD document, the IRD has been concentrating on preventing an extreme left alliance from gaining power in the 1970 presidential election and helping suitable organisations which are likely to continue in existence whatever happens. So there you've got a clear case of the British Foreign Office, actively subverting the process of democracy in Latin America, and that is in that period the clearest case after the Cuban Revolution of a real strategic threat to British interests. But I mean the IRD wasn't just operating in Cuba and Chile. I mean, it was operating all throughout the region, virtually in every single country in Latin America throughout the 1960s and 1970s. And Brazil is another key case. So in Brazil as well, there was a coup in 1964 against João Goulart, who was attempting, a kind of wide-ranging land reform, extending suffrage to the poorest Brazilians. And so the IRD in Brazil, it starts assisting some of the big business organizations. Similar to in Chile, it's producing black propaganda. It's creating false documents alongside the CIA, basically in order to promote disturbance in Brazil in the run-up to the coup. And shortly after the coup, you have one IRD official actually boasting that about Britain's contribution to the defeat of communism in Brazil. So, I mean, within these documents, you've actually got Britain basically claiming. Obviously, it's difficult to quantify the level of success that the IRD had in Latin America at this time, but you actually have them boasting that they played a pivotal and significant role in coups in the region. Another case study that I've been working on quite significantly at the moment is IRD in Colombia. And IRD in Colombia, I mean, it started well into the 1950s, but during the 1960s again, it's involved in helping the Colombian military with counterinsurgency. Obviously, in Colombia, in 1964, you have the proliferation of a number of different guerrilla organizations. Colombia is important as well because of its strategic location. Obviously, it meets both the Pacific and the Atlantic. It sits right next to, it borders the Panama with the Panama Canal. And at the time, BP and Shell also had some interests in Colombia. So by the end of the 1960s in Colombia, there's kind of fears within the Foreign Office that there's going to be a coup. The ANAPO party that was led by the former dictator Rojas Pinilla is basically looking to be a third force for the first time in Colombian politics since the 1800s. So what the IRD does, it basically plans for the potential outcome of a coup by inviting high-ranking Colombian military officials to Britain for training in anti-communist propaganda and counterinsurgency techniques. So, I mean, especially throughout the 1960s, you've got a clear pattern of British kind of covert assistance to a number of different kind of military organizations, political organizations, media organizations throughout the region. And it's all kind of going in one similar direction. First of all, Britain is obviously always going to want to protect whatever commercial interests it has. But secondly, obviously, Cuba and Chile especially posed a real symbolic threat. The kind of threat of a successful, in the case of Chile, democratic revolution, in the case of Cuba, an armed revolution, posed a massive threat to British interests in the region, because obviously the concern was that those would spread, those would spread across the region, and I mean, it doesn't just stop there as well. I'm working on some documents at the moment that relate to Argentina. Just a year before the coup in Argentina, you have the British government, the coup in 1976 in Argentina. Just a year before this, the IRD is inviting military officials from the Argentinian military to come over to Britain to learn anti-communist techniques. It's not clear at the moment whether that actually happened or not, but it'd be quite interesting to see, which military officials came over and what role they actually ended up having in the coup of 1976. And Peru, Bolivia, a number of different countries across the region as well. So I suppose the point that I'm getting at is that the declassification process over the past few years has really shown a new light on British foreign policy in Latin America. It's shown us obviously what we already knew to a degree, that Britain had some commercial interests, but Britain had much greater geostrategic interests in Latin America than we were formerly aware of. It was also extremely willing to use the special relationship in order to further its own interests, but also leverage the special relationship so that it could pursue its own interests elsewhere in the world. Certain scholars would say that this is very minimal. The IRD was only a certain number of people in Latin America, and it's impossible to quantify the impact that they had. But if you look at the documents themselves, IRD officials are quite consistently saying that they had, a real tangible impact in Latin America when it came to a number of different coups. The Latin American governments themselves generally perceived IRD assistance to be, pivotal in the kind of campaigns, the counterinsurgency campaigns that they were operating at the time. So I think it's quite facile to kind of bat this history of 1960s British foreign policy in Latin America as inconsequential, or just a case of minor statecraft. I think it's quite clear from the declassified file that Britain had a real impact across the region, and was up to quite a wide range of sinister policies as well. As I started as well, I feel like when we talk about contemporary British involvement in Latin America, when it comes to Venezuela or Brazil or Colombia or elsewhere, there's not much of a historical context to go off, and there's not much of a kind of a linearity of British policies in Latin America, where you can kind of compare and contrast what's happening. But in my opinion, there's generally a large amount of consistency between the British foreign policy in Latin America during the 60s and 70s and 80s, and what we're seeing now with the support for Bolsonaro, with the attempts to support a coup in Venezuela. To a large degree, long story short, very little has changed when comparing to the Cold War years.
Thank you so much, John. And for anyone that's interested in the contemporary sort of role of Britain, I'd urge you to read John's work exposing the role of the British government in trying to help the US essentially overthrow the Venezuelan government, which has had a regime change agenda there for pretty much since Chavez came to power in 1999. So his work in the Canaries, also published in Declassified articles around that. Matt, I wanted to turn to you and speak about this contemporary role of the UK. John's really expertly summarized the UK's sort of recent role in Latin America. But in terms of what you've been writing about for Declassified. I mean, perhaps tell us a little bit about Declassified, why you started it, and then, and particularly, I'm interested in the sort of two articles: one that you wrote regarding the UK's role in the 2019 coup in Bolivia, and another that discusses the extent of UK military aid to the far right Duque government in Colombia. So yeah, if you could tell us about Declassified and some of these articles.
We started Declassified. What is it now? Our first article we published in September 2019. So 2.5 years ago. And actually, the first article we did is an expression, I guess, of why we started it, because it was all about the Guardian and what had happened to the Guardian since the Snowden revelations and the early WikiLeaks releases as well, which is that effectively it had been co-opted and captured by the state. And there's another story to do as well about the Guardian of how it's been captured by corporations, but I haven't done that yet. But effectively, hitherto to that point, or to kind of the Snowden revelations, the Guardian was the only mainstream newspaper in Britain that was doing any kind of decent work on the reality of the UK's role in the world, foreign policy, military policy, intelligence policy. It wasn't great. It was always a liberal paper, had all the trappings that come with that, and it was an establishment organ the whole time. But it did have good reporters that would cover things fairly, and that goes back to a long way in Latin America as well. But obviously that's changed now. So we started Declassified to kind of perform that role, obviously in a better way than the Guardian did, but to really reveal what Britain is up to in the world, because effectively now it's surround sound propaganda. You have effectively statements coming from the government, which are just repeated across the spectrum. And once you start looking into the facts, as John does in the archives, and through the Freedom of Information Act, you just realize it's effectively all propaganda, and the reality is actually the opposite of what we're told. So we're told we care for freedom and democracy, and we and sovereignty, and in fact, of course, we're basically working the whole time to try and overthrow any government that doesn't do as we tell them. So that's why we started Declassified. In terms of the articles that I've done in Latin America, I think it's worth saying that, as John mentioned, John was talking about how when you look at the declassified files, you realize actually the kind of prevailing narrative that Britain was a kind of ancillary power after the Second World War, and the empire died, and we didn't really have these interests that we were projecting, or at least we weren't doing it in any kind of full-throated way. That's not true. And I think this idea that the empire died is incorrect. We still have a lot of overseas territories. We still have, as Phil Miller, my colleague, did a whole story about how many bases we've got around the world, loads. We prop up dictatorships all over the world because they do as we tell them. So the idea that the British Empire died, I think, is wrong. Obviously, it changed and it sort of hitched itself to the US Empire, but it still projects its power in nefarious ways. Now, what in terms of Latin America, why that's interesting is because Latin America for a long time has been the only place that's consistently allowed for liberation leaders to come to power democratically. So it's a real hope for the whole world, and has been, well, especially in the dark times after the end of the Cold War, when you had the Zapatistas in the early 90s. But before Chavez, there wasn't much, and then they had Aristide in Haiti, and then you had Chavez. But in that period, when it was pretty barren for the left, Latin America was the only sort of place of hope, and it's kind of continued like that. And you obviously had the pink tide, which is still going on. So Britain has been consistently against those liberation leaders, because effectively our foreign policy is about projecting UK commercial interests and geopolitical interests, and all these independence leaders are about making their country sovereign for the first time, some of them since the Spanish arrived, and also making sure that the people of those countries benefit from the natural resources, which again is against the interests of British foreign policy. So you understand why Britain stands against these leaders, and I think that the sort of purest example of that is what happened in Bolivia, which I've been interested in for many years, because in my opinion, what happened under Evo Morales from 2005 to the coup in 2019 is probably the most successful experiment in democratic socialism in human history, sustained experiment. There's obviously been smaller, shorter experiments, but that one was, even the World Bank and IMF and these kind of imperialist institutions praised what they did there in terms of bringing people out of poverty. And well, obviously they didn't praise nationalizations, but they did a lot of brilliant work. And part of that is because they didn't come under, they were allowed the space to do it because they didn't come under the attack that Venezuela did, because Venezuela obviously sits on the second largest proven oil reserves in the world, according to some estimates, the largest. So obviously the empire was much more interested in getting rid of a leader that wanted to take those resources and give them to the people that sat on top of them. They were much more, that was much more important strategically for the empire. So Bolivia was allowed a little bit of space, but it does kind of show you what happens when the empire takes its eye off the ball. And I think it's an interesting thing, because people often say another world is possible, another world is possible. We have to have hope. There is a lot of hope, because people need to understand that it takes a lot of effort to destroy these liberation movements. Like they've organically come up in Guatemala, in Chile, in Bolivia. They've happened, and there's been a lot. There's had to be a concerted effort, sometimes military, but as John was talking about, covert intelligence operations, whatever it is, to destroy these liberation movements. So in Bolivia, just to talk specifically about the story I did a story which actually got quite a lot of traction in there, because it related to the British role in the 2019 coup, which, so I mean, most people will be aware of what happened in Bolivia. There was an election which was disputed by the OAS, and then so they said they were going to produce a report. There was a month of unrest, and then when they released the report and said that there was irregularities, the military took control. In fact, there's a lot of propaganda about what happened, but Evo resigned, even though he knew that it was a military coup, because he wanted to avoid violence. So it was a kind of an amazingly selfless act that Morales did. But he obviously fled. He was not granted safe passage to Argentina, which was then run by the far right sort of Trump character Macri. He was saved by AMLO's government, who sent the presidential plane. It subsequently came out that the opposition were trying to shoot down that plane and kill Evo Morales. But and then he came back the following year. Democracy was restored, which again is another unprecedented occurrence, because obviously with the Allende we have the tragedy of '73 and the coup, and that was it. It obliterated hope and obliterated democracy and obliterated all the movements for decades. I don't know of another example of a CIA Western-backed coup in Latin America being reversed the year after. So again, another hope for Bolivia. But anyway, there was some work done on the US, what the US role was, but there was nothing done about Britain. So I, through the Freedom of Information Act, got hold of 20 pages of documents about different programs that the British were running in Bolivia, and it showed that effectively they supported the coup, and in fact become a strategic partner to the coup regime soon after, and organized mining conferences, brought in all sorts of companies to try and take advantage of the new Bolivia, which was basically effectively open it up to Western investment and rape the country, which has happened for 500 years. And Evo was the first leader for, well, maybe ever, that said no more. So they wanted it back to how it was, which was we can just go there and take what we want. And just to talk about how they did it, the ambassador there, who's called Jeff Gleckin, the funny thing is he's still in post. After this article, it became quite a big deal in Bolivia, and there was some talk about him actually getting kicked out of the country, but it never happened. But he's still there. But he I mean, it was such a horrendous inhumanity of how that guy acted when after the coup, because he not only did he back the coup, but 2 weeks after, there were two massacres in Sacaba and Saint Dada. I don't know if I'm pronouncing those right, but anyway, two massacres which happened soon after the coup regime took power. They enacted a law which meant that it gave impunity to the security forces, which was basically a green light to say, kill who you want. Anyone who raises a hand to the security forces, take him out. You're not going to be punished. Anyway, the day after that law was passed, one of those massacres occurred. Then a week later, another one. This guy Glekin, this ambassador, had a Downton Abbey themed fancy dress party at the UK embassy 2 weeks after one of those massacres, and posted pictures of it on Twitter. So like that's the level of humanity that the UK ambassador in Bolivia has when indigenous, and to be honest with you, it's a totally racist thing. If those were white people that have been killed, that would never happen. But they'd wiped out a couple of dozen indigenous people. It didn't matter. Let's have a party, you know. And that's, for me, it was kind of a parable for British foreign policy, because it at the time, he was the funny. I unfortunately had to read all his interviews that he gave in that period. And one of the funny ones, about 6 months after the coup, was he was asked by an interviewer, "What's your proudest moment as the UK ambassador to Bolivia?" And he said, "Oh, it was to help the transition to democracy after the irregularities of the 2019 vote." And I just thought, how sick is that? You know, like that, your proudest moment is basically dancing on the graves and having a party on the graves of over 20 indigenous people that were wiped out by a coup regime you were supported. So Bolivia is a specific case, but it generalizes over the whole of Latin America. Everywhere you look and you see independence movements, the British are trying to overthrow them. And any kind of, as I mentioned before, any kind of government that wants to use their natural resources for the benefit of the people, again, the British will be trying to overthrow you. So I think that Latin America is a particular. It's not this modus vivendi of UK foreign policy is not specific to Latin America, but Latin America is a very specific case, because there's a good side and a bad side. Unfortunately, in a lot of places in the world, there's not these kind of liberation movements, or at least they exist, but they're much more marginalized. They're very close to power in Latin America, so it's very easy to see and discern UK priorities in Latin America.
Matt, so I know I asked about the Colombia article, but I see Vicky, I think from Declassified, is sharing articles, and perhaps she can share that one, because I wanted to ask a pickup question, and we've got, I think, 5 or 6 questions come in and a comment, and I want to have enough time to get to those, I think, but in terms of the reaction to for example, the Bolivia article, Vicky's just shared that the British government asked you to retract that. So if you tell us a little bit about the reaction from the UK government, but also I'm interested in what has been the reaction to these kind of exposés in, I mean, yeah, the mainstream, obviously the Guardian. I'm guessing that you didn't get the Telegraph and the Times and perhaps the Guardian reporting on this, but also in terms of maybe even the independent media outlets. That there aren't many, but there are a few in the UK and elsewhere. I mean, was this kind of stuff being reported? I know there was a question around why Latin America is so marginal, but yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit about the UK government's reaction and the media's reaction to some of them.
Yeah, but the whole edifice stands because of a propaganda technique called censorship by omission. So the actual reality of anything, and it's not just what I'm talking about, anything about UK foreign policy, the real facts and the things that would allow you to understand how UK foreign policy works just aren't reported. So in this case, and we've seen that across the board with Declassified. We had an occasion where we were blacklisted by the Ministry of Defence, and they ordered the Defence Secretary spoke about us in the House of Parliament. He ordered a review, and it was by an establishment guy, Tony Blair's former spokesman. It was like thousands of words long, a really worrying report. Not one newspaper's ever mentioned it. And this is to go back to Bolivia, like the ambassador was called in by the foreign minister, Rogelio Macha, for a meeting. It was all over. Like, if you see a picture of him coming out of this meeting, there's like tons of media with all these microphones, and he's like, "Oh, we didn't do anything. We didn't support the coup." and it's quite funny to see. And there were cartoons were appearing in the taking the piss out of him in the Bolivian press. Again, not one newspaper in the whole of the UK reported on it. It's bananas, but that's because it doesn't fit the narrative. That's what I'm saying. So censorship by omission just creates this massive hypnosis about what the UK does, because no one's ever exposed to the facts of the reality. So in terms of independent media, it was covered, like the paper that's covered us repeatedly is the Morning Star, which obviously has some independence from the state, which doesn't exist in the mainstream. The Canary covers us, but that's about it. And obviously Alborada as well. But there is I often wonder what we'd have to do to actually get mentioned in the press. If for example, that Gleckin was booted out after that article, if that had got in the press. But you know what? I don't think it would have. I think that I don't know if it's a conscious. Maybe the Guardian even has a policy that they're not allowed to cover us. But in terms of the mainstream media, it's just it's impossible in my opinion.
Just before we go to questions, because we do have tons in the chat, I'd just like to know, and I think it's a question for you both, is, do you know, to what extent is this the tip of the iceberg? Because John mentioned at the beginning just how difficult it is to do this kind of work, because the British government is so secretive about its foreign policy. So, you know, these just kind of like, just, you know, is this like the whole picture or close to the whole picture, or do you still think there's a lot that can be uncovered, or is perhaps never going to be uncovered because of the secrecy surrounding British foreign policy? I don't know, John, do you want to come in, and then maybe Matt, if you could jump in afterwards?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it definitely is the tip of the iceberg. An author called Ian Cobain wrote a book called The History Thieves, which is basically about throughout British history, there's just been a continuous process of just setting a bonfire to official documents in a number of different ways, but also a really intricate process of censorship as well within Britain. And I mean, when it comes to, for example, when I'm doing freedom of information requests on Venezuela, you get documents back. I mean, they agree to release documents, and then you get full A4 spreads that are entirely redacted. I mean, it's almost totally pointless of releasing anything at all. And another author called Grace Livingston, who's written about British foreign policy in Chile and Argentina, she's found consistently that the Foreign Office has destroyed hundreds, if not thousands, of documents relating to, I mean, especially British relations with the dictatorships in Chile and Argentina. But I mean, I've also found this myself. I was looking for documents relating to actually kind of internal spying on Latin American solidarity organizations, specifically the Chile Solidarity Committee, and the degree to which, because the IRD operated domestically as well, it had an English desk where it basically organized countermeasures against journalists or spied on solidarity organizations, or basically operated against anything that might pose a threat to the machinations of British foreign policy. And the only years for which it maintained documents was 1974. Everything else had been destroyed for 1970, 1975, 1976, 1977, 1978, and 1979. Everything had been destroyed, and they justify it by saying it's ephemeral, or they say that it's it's not in the public interest. But then you have to look at what's the process by which they decide what is and what is not in the public interest. And the people who are deciding what's declassified in the National Archives, for example, or what constitutes information within the public interest, there's barely ever a situation where there's not a conflict of interest there itself. So to take another example, for somebody involved in the declassification process at the National Archives was once a UKIP candidate, but he also worked for an organisation called Defence Systems Limited. And Defence Systems Limited was involved with protecting BP's oil installations in Colombia. So when I'm looking at Colombia at the moment, and I'm thinking, is something going to come out about Defence Systems Limited, or Defence System is kind of subsidiary Defense Systems Colombia's operations in Colombia, it was up to some horrific activities protecting BP's oil installations. There's no chance that that's going to be declassified anytime soon. If somebody on the board of who decides what's declassified is actually, in charge of what is supposedly in the public interest or not. So you've got kind of basically several different tiers of, censorship. It runs from straight up destroying documents to, kind of filtering them out of the public office system to then, I think Matt can talk about this a bit more as well, but you're subject to something called the D notice, which is basically, among the mainstream media, kind of gentleman's agreement between the government and journalists, which basically they say, look, we'd prefer if you didn't publish this, because this is, this is something that is dangerous for national security, for example. But more often than not, it's dangerous for, it's a national embarrassment rather than a threat to national security. And again, more times than that, and I'll let Matt talk a little bit more about this, but more times than not, journalists just agree to do this. And it tells you a lot about journalists' relationship with the state, and also about the state's kind of supposedly a hands-off censorship process, but it doesn't have to be hands-on if the journalists are just happy to do it anyway. But
yeah, I'd agree with John. There's this thing in intelligence, they call it a limited hangout, where they give you a little bit of revelatory information to make you think you're getting the story, but in fact it's some kind of ruse to basically hold back the important stuff that would allow you to understand. And I think that operates with a lot of this stuff. As John said, a lot of the censors at the National Archives have a history in, say, MI5 and other parts of the state that have an interest in projecting an image of British history which is conducive to the state. So, yeah, we're definitely not getting a picture. The amazing thing is how damning stuff we do get is. So that makes you wonder what the real stuff, what the stuff that they're holding back is like. And this again goes to another point John made, which is about how the gentleman's agreement between the state and journalists, which operates in a very cozy way in Britain. Like there isn't really a need for overt censorship, because there's all these mechanisms of co-option which exist to stop journalists ever really putting out the information that would make the state look bad. The Notice Committee, as John mentioned, is one example, and we had a experience with it where, just for people who don't know what it is, the Notice Committee is this committee which meets every 6 months at the Ministry of Defence. It has a collection of security officials and a collection of top journalists, and they basically meet every 6 months and discuss what's going on and what kind of special operations and what kind of intelligence operations are happening, and what can they report. Now, the D-Notice Committee say, we have no way of enforcing our recommendations to you. If you publish something and we think you should censor it, we can't enforce it. But they don't need to, because if they ever go to what the relationship is developed and they cultivated the journalists to a point that if they say that something shouldn't be published, they're friends. The journalists instantly say, okay, we'll do that. And a way of knowing this is we were contacted by them to censor part of our story about UK support for the Cameroonian dictator, and we refused and published an article about why we said no. Now, I've never heard of any other journalist or any other outlet coming out and saying we've said no to a D-Notice Committee. That's probably because they haven't, not because they're too scared to say it in public. That's probably because that's probably the first time for a long time, the D-Notice Committee has had a refusal. And to go back to the first article I talked about with our Guardian story, that again, the D-Notice Committee had a role in that, because during the Snowden revelations, they were calling up Alan Rusbridger and saying you shouldn't publish the Snowden revelations. And then they, as part of the negotiations with the Guardian deputy editor then was given a seat on the D-Notice Committee. So it's this whole process of cultivation, and it works. And they actually don't know what to do when you have journalists like us at Declassified, and John is a part of Declassified and has published a stream of really important stories on all sorts of topics. But they don't know what to do when journalists actually have the attitude that you're theoretically told you should have as a journalist, which is adversarial, taking on power. All journalists like to think they're doing that, but none of them do. And when you actually do, the state doesn't know how to handle it. And just to go back to the Bolivia story, one of the funny, like, we were actually overtly attacked by the UK embassy in Bolivia. They released a statement accusing us of a campaign of disinformation, and we had to get a legal letter sent to the Foreign Office to ask them to take it down, because in UK military strategy documents, if you're accused of being an agent of disinformation, you can be attacked by military and intelligence agencies. That gives them that license. So we were saying, look, this is serious. You can't just accuse us of it without any evidence, which they didn't have. And they didn't take it down in the end. But the point is, that's the kind of, they get freaked out if journalists take on power. So yeah, I mean, it's going to get worse and worse now because of the Ukraine situation, and we're into a new Cold War. Anyone who deviates from the prevailing narrative is seen as an enemy or an agent of the Russians or whatever it is. So I think that you're going to see increasingly stringent guidelines and being enforced about what journalists can publish. And there was a recent recommendation from a Home Office. Priti Patel asked for some recommendations on how to reform the Official Secrets Act, and they recommended that you could be put in prison for publishing information that was embarrassing to the government. So it effectively would outlaw national security reporting. It hasn't been enacted yet, but as I say, this is the way we're going, and it fits in with the whole clampdown on civil liberties, which you're seeing on protest and whatever it is. Because effectively, the state sees proper investigative journalism as an enemy, and they have done for decades. As John says, the IRD, that they were explicit about it. They explicitly saw people who were revealing information that was truthful as the enemy, and were devising countermeasures against them. That's going to escalate, and obviously Julian Assange is in Belmarsh prison. And probably going to be sent to the US. So yeah, it's not good. Doesn't look good.
No, absolutely. And it's although we only have an hour and there's so much we could cover, and we probably won't have time to go into the UK and its relationship with the Lenin Moreno government, which essentially turned over Julian Assange, who's now a political prisoner of the UK government, a journalist who's been imprisoned for exposing US war crimes. Our government feels it can pontificate about freedom of expression while it closes foreign TV stations and foreign media outlets. But anyway, so we have questions coming in. We have comments. We have a comment there. We have two comments. One from Richard Spence. IRD has been set up again, with a link to a Spectator article that looks interesting. We have another comment by Patrick Black. Britain was very much involved, along with the US, of course, in assisting the Brazilian military in the '64 coup in Brazil, the extent of which is only now starting to come out. We actually have, I'm going to go with a question, the latest one I've seen there from John Perry, who seems to be in Nicaragua, saying, do you agree that the Foreign Office deliberately closes its ears to evidence that contradicts its policy lines? I live and write from Nicaragua, and the FCO has effectively blocked me from having contact with them, even though I have offered direct evidence about the violent coup attempt here in 2018. This, of course, challenges their policy line, which faithfully follows that of the US. Peter Watt, I'll put two questions out, and then maybe Rachel, if you want to come in after John and Matt. One here from Peter Watt. Are you also being attacked and smeared by outlets like The Guardian, given that your work also exposed the state of UK journalism and should be very embarrassing to people like Tom Phillips, who, if you don't know, is the latest so-called journalist or Latin America editor that The Guardian has. They've had numerous in the last few years who haven't covered themselves in glory, to put it mildly. So there's two questions, and just to say that John and I actually did write an article on the relationship between The Guardian and Assange for Mint Press News that really does ask some very difficult questions for some of the journalists that have covered the Assange case. And I would argue that, as with Assange, as with the left in Latin America, The Guardian has been at the forefront of smearing both of these. So yeah, over to John and Matt with those two questions.
Yeah, I'll kind of combine the two. Not being attacked nor smeared by The Guardian, not yet anyway. I mean, it would be a testament to impact if you were, but But the Guardian itself closes its ears to any criticism of it. I mean, you mentioned Tom Phillips. I think Tom Phillips is the only person I'm aware of that has me blocked on Twitter. And in general, I try to maintain a certain level of professionalism on Twitter. I don't really argue with anyone, and if I do, keep it fairly civil. And I mean, Tom Phillips wrote something about Bolsonaro. I mean, he's written a few things about Bolsonaro. He said he was in another life, Bolsonaro and Lula would have been friends. He also said he was gobsmacked to hear Juan Guaido name drop Bolsonaro. And I kind of put these thoughts of his in a thread, like underneath something that he'd written, basically just demonstrating how incongruous his logic about what, you know, the politics of Latin America is. Lula, for example, described Juan Guaido as basically as a total joke. I mean, Tom Phillips couldn't imagine how Lula and Juan Guaido wouldn't be, you know, ideological fellow travelers somehow. So I mean, the Guardian it kind of lives in its own little liberal bubble. That's how its reporting works in Latin America as well. I mean, the Tom Phillips fixes across Latin America, of course, are probably picked from the kind of middle class of Latin America, and he gets to see a certain side of Latin America that, you know, if you kind of looked from the ground up, you would have a different perspective. So yeah, I mean, the Guardian, as Matt said, it has a general policy of ignoring independent media. It hasn't reported on a number of big stories with relation to Latin America that Declassified and myself have dropped. For example, British involvement in the coup in Venezuela. The Guardian often has times to publish stories about the most trivial of events in Latin America, but when there's a diplomatic dispute that erupts as a result of my reporting on Britain's creation of a secret reconstruction unit, basically designed to reconstruct Venezuela's economy in a hypothetical post-coup scenario, the Guardian just totally ignored it. So yeah, I mean, the mainstream media has more of a policy of just shutting their ears. I don't think the Foreign Office has ever had much of a history of listening to distant voices. Yeah.
I'll just echo what John's saying. Basically, if you're a smart propagandist, and you have the sort of means of intellectual production, printing presses and the big readerships and big outreach, you don't want to promote dissident voices in any way, even if you're smearing them. The best thing to do is just ignore them, because then if you smear them, you run the risk of making them relevant. I had a sort of very specific experience with this when I wrote a book called The Racket in 2015, based on reporting I'd done while I was at the Financial Times. A lot of it in Latin America, actually, Haiti, Bolivia, Venezuela, and I published it. And one of my friends, I was wondering if it was going to get reviewed in the FT. I thought unlikely, but one of my friends who I still had at the FT said that they overheard some people talking about it. And one of them was like, "Yeah, we should write a hit review," and the other one was like, "No, don't do that. That's the worst thing to do. Then it will put it on the map. We should just ignore it," which is what they did, and it did. It was ignored widely. In fact, the funny thing is that the only newspaper that reviewed it was The Guardian. And the first paragraph compared it to the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So there you get a sense of, and actually that was a bad move from The Guardian, because they did a hit job on it. It was a complete hit job. They wrote a whole review of the book, which was it was all styled around me being a Financial Times journalist. And they didn't mention once that I worked for the Financial Times. Because they wanted to project an image of just a conspiracist and But anyway, it was but they shot themselves in the foot with that, because it became that hit piece became a sort of was tweeted around, and people got to know the book because of that hit piece. So that's an example of what not to do. I think that, as John says, I think if you get to a certain level of prominence, then that changes. So someone like Assange was having sort of global impact in the mainstream. So then it's much more important to pour resources into destroying someone like that. So it really is related to your profile. As long as you're marginalized, it's better to keep you there. What was the other question? Do you agree? Oh, do they lock at? Yeah, of course. The UK government, I think most people who work within it know what's going on. They know what drives policy, and it's not human rights, freedom, democracy, or the things they tell you. So they live in a system where they have to lock out and ignore any information which contradicts the policies which they're enacting. So that means that they just close their ears to anyone. I mean, the only place I've ever been where I've heard like a British official speak sanely, funnily enough, was in East Jerusalem, where I interviewed someone at the UK embassy about the disposition of the Palestinian community in Sheikh Jarrah, and she was really denouncing it and saying this stops the ability for there to be any kind of peace. And I was sort of taken aback a bit because I've never ever interviewed a UK official who was saying anything that had any kind of relation to reality. But yeah, generally they're not interested. And in fact, they'll just, if you get to a level where you have an impact like the Bolivia story did, they'll just accuse you of disinformation or conspiracies. It's quite interesting, actually. Those are the two things that they use now. If you say anything which is against their narrative, they say either you're an agent of disinformation or you're a conspiracist. They don't have to qualify them because that instantly puts you in a different bracket to a real journalist. And the disinformation one was quite interesting in the case of Bolivia, because that was information that I actually got from them. So they were saying their own information was disinformation. Bananas. Anyway.
I'm really sorry if we're not going to get to everyone's questions because there are so many. We do have two about Chile and Peru and kind of what both countries can expect. So Marcela Joffre is saying, what should we expect in terms of foreign policy after Boric's election in Chile? So the new left-wing president there has just been sworn in. I don't know if either of you have seen anything, you know, from the British kind of foreign ministry indicating what their relationship is going to be with Chile's new government. And then we have down here another question. I think there's one on Peru somewhere, but it was basically, I'm sorry, I've missed Vanessa Bird. Yeah, what can we expect to see in Peru? I'm not an expert on Peru, but there's, you know, a left-wing president there, Pedro Castillo, and there seems to be some kind of impeachment attempt against him there, which we've seen used before by the right wing in Latin America. It's kind of like a soft coup. So I don't know if you know, either of you, if you've got any kind of thoughts on either of those questions. That'd be great to hear it.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, go for it.
If you want it. Yeah, well, I mean, my answer isn't going to be that substantial, to be honest. I mean, it's hard to tell what's going to happen with Boric at the moment. Alan McLeod wrote a really good article actually about Boric's positions. I mean, at the moment, he seems to be trying to present himself as part of the kind of the respectable left, in inverted commas, as you see in Latin America. So he's been quite hot to criticize the key kind of targets of US imperialism, Venezuela and Nicaragua. But I mean, it remains to be seen. It also remains to be seen to what degree he's going to pursue the kind of regional integration programs as well. I just think it's too early days to go too deep into what Boric represents. But I mean, he's also got a very rich history of solidarity with the Palestinians as well. So, you know, it's not a clear-cut case of, you know, Boric is is happy to throw some targets of US imperialism under the bus in order to maintain some kind of stability in Chile. With Peru, I just don't know. But there was a third question, which was, what was the effect of the Malvinas-Falklands War on relations between UK and other Latin American militaries, which I wanted to come to very, very briefly, because it's quite an interesting topic. It's when Britain responded to the Argentine invasion of the Malvinas in 1982, the only Latin American country to actually side with Britain was Colombia. So I mean, it didn't overtly criticize Britain at the OAS. It also decided not to vote on the Rio Protocol, which is basically one member of once Latin American state gets attacked, it's taken as an attack on all of Latin America. And I mean, Colombia's, and this kind of relates to what we're seeing with Ukraine at the moment. Colombia has a rich history of being, being one of the arms of the US foreign policy in the region. It was the only country in 1953, I believe, to send troops to the Korean War. It was sympathetic to the Vietnam War. It was also sympathetic during the First Gulf War and the Iraq War. And then, I mean, the Hueys that were coming from Iraq ended up back in Colombia to fight its drug war as well. And now you've got Colombia as one of the few NATO partners, the only, I believe, NATO partner in Latin America. Obviously, it's not an official member of NATO, but it's, I believe, the only NATO partner. So, yeah, I mean, the effect that it had was Colombia was isolated to the rest of Latin America when it came to the Falklands War in effectively supporting Britain. And in the aftermath of that, Jeffrey Howe, who was a foreign secretary at the time, did 3 separate tours of Latin America, basically trying to rebuild relations with the region. Because, Latin American nations in general stood in solidarity with the Argentinians, even if in private, especially to British officials, they did voice concern about what happened. So yeah, that's my answer to one too many questions probably, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with John that it's too early to say, but what I could say, which has some relevance to the question, is what happens to progressive governments when they step into power within a system which has been built effectively over decades to promote imperial interests, whether that be corporations or geopolitical interests of states. You find that you instantly, every incentive is there for you to stop any kind of radical program. So if you want to, for example, Castillo, I think, had said before he was elected in Peru that he was going to nationalize the mines. That's never going to happen, because as soon as you step into it, I don't know if it gets as literal as you'll be overthrown if you do that, but there's many ways, there's many mechanisms to stop you having any kind of liberatory program. And you see that, like, I mean, the case where I saw it really quite clearly was in El Salvador when we went there in 2014, and the FMLN were in power. And they obviously were the Marxist guerrillas, or the party that they were the Marxist guerrillas during the Civil War. And we talked to ministers, and they said, and we were talking to them about why their program was so tepid. And they said, well, we have no space to move. We literally can't do anything because there's all these agreements were signed when capitalism won. All these agreements, bilateral investment treaties, trade agreements, aid programs, all these agreements, it's like a web of control, which means even if a liberation leader is elected, they have no space to move at all. The system we were looking at specifically in the case of El Salvador was ISDS, which is this system whereby corporations can sue states. And they were talking to us about mines they wanted to close, but they couldn't because they would be hit by lawsuits by the mining companies, which would just ruin the finances of the government. So I think that what happens in the case of Boric and Castillo is that the system kind of tries them out and says, are you willing to play ball at all? And if they're willing to play ball, then fine, they'll be kept in line. If they're not, then they revert to a second stage of subversion, which is a much more serious subversion than what you see in Venezuela and Bolivia. And what happened there compared to what happened under Lula, who I think played ball in a much more real way with the imperial interests, was completely different. Nationalization is effectively the red line for the empire. If you start nationalizing your industries, that's when they're gonna revert to a kind of a second stage subversion. So I mean, I from what I've seen of Boric, he probably won't be that radical. And in the case of Castillo, I think Peru is so ensnared in this system that he's shown that he hasn't really got the will to override it. So yeah, I don't hold up much hope for that.
No, absolutely. What you're saying is completely true, Matt. And the way that neoliberalism gets locked in through, in the case of Chile, through Pinochet's constitution, which incredibly is still in force today, and that's one of the major fights in Chile is to replace that with the new constitutional process that's underway. And neoliberalism, more often than not, is brought in through extreme violence, state terrorism. So this idea that capitalism and freedom, that people, the famous Milton Friedman book, is just really a sort of bad joke. We were meant to finish 6 minutes ago, but we're still going. We had a lot of questions. We're sorry for those that we're not going to be able to ask. I just wanted to end with this question that I saw that was quite interesting. It was probably for John, but again, you might not have covered this area. But Kevin Nelson earlier put a question, very much part of the Cold War playbook, British intelligence targeted unions in Latin America. The question is, and he put a link to a BBC article, has John picked up on any complicity in that era by the TUC, Union Internationals, or British unions? And I'm just remembering one of the WikiLeaks declassified documents, I believe, mentioned the former TUC General Secretary as someone that was at least providing some level of information or in conversations with the US ambassador. So yeah, John, I don't know if you've looked into this issue at all, or Matt.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, there are actually some files in the National Archives that are IRD files specifically about sharing information with the TUC, sharing information with heads of the TUC during the Cold War. But another thing that occurred with the TUC was there was a kind of two front organisations. One was called the Atlas Foundation, one was called the Ariel Foundation. And one of their key kind of roles was to bring either church or union figures from Britain or from Latin America over to vice versa. So there was often situations where the IRD would bring TUC staff over to Latin America to meet unions in Latin America and kind of discuss with them how to be a good union, how to be a bit less radical, how to promote the doctrine of social democracy, how to not be too much of a thorn in the side of the government. And the TUC doesn't have a particularly radical legacy, and so it was the TUC and a number of different unions in the UK could play quite a useful role for the British state. And just on a personal level, it comes across in the files that more often than not, some of these union figures, they were simply just happy to get a holiday over to Latin America to just do a talk for an hour. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously quite a trope with the big union bosses, but yeah, you can read that through the files. Yeah, that the British state kind of weaponized, de-radicalized union leaders to kind of preach, how unions function in the UK and good union activity.
I mean, I can't speak specifically to that case in Latin America, but from the research I've done, it is quite clear that the CIA is much more, and this was during the Cold War, but subsequent as well, it's much more interested in cultivating the left and organised labour than it has ever been about cultivating the right. And in fact, in the UK situation, I don't know if many people have heard of the British American Project. It was founded in 1983 by the US Embassy in conjunction with some big industrialists, and they were worried. I mean, this is all on record. They were worried about Michael Foot's leadership of the Labour Party because it was the first non-Atlanticist leader of the Labour Party for maybe forever, because obviously Attlee was very pro-America. And they founded this to kind of very actively cultivate the left because they didn't want to lose the left. And that's carried on these days. And you see it with all the kind of propaganda that's out now about, and a good example is someone like Paul Mason. If you see what he says, he literally ventriloquizes CIA talking points. He wants to project the image of NATO being a progressive force, which is completely ahistorical. NATO was effectively set up to stop the left being able to win power in Europe, so in Western Europe. So we need to be very, very wary of that. And it exists for organised labour, it exists for the Labour Party, which they've effectively, and that's why we saw it with Corbyn as well. I mean, Corbyn obviously was, after Michael Foot, was the first non-Atlanticist Labour leader as well. So there was a lot of effort to destroy him and make sure that will never happen again. And I'm working on a story now about an organization like the British American Project, which was created similarly by people similarly worried about the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, like they were in the 80s worried about the leadership of Michael Foot.
Okay, well, I'm gonna wrap up because I think we could go on for another hour, but I don't think we should. I just want to thank Matt and John for their fascinating insights into UK foreign policy towards Latin America. I want to thank Rachel for co-chairing and for all the people that contributed their comments and their questions. Again, sorry to those that we couldn't cover. I'll just say that we have, as someone mentioned, Grace Livingston's work, an excellent academic journalist who's written books on US foreign policy, and one of her books is on the UK foreign policy in Argentina and Chile during the dictatorships. And in fact, it was the first Alborada online, these type of events that we did. And so maybe we can put a link to the directory of those events, which started around March 2020, or shortly after the pandemic hit. We also had one on the media and UK media coverage of Latin America, or mainstream media coverage, again with John and Matt, I think in June. So yeah, if you want to look back at those, feel free. And yeah, thanks again for everyone that attended. I think we're going to put the music back on for a bit and then close the event. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you at a future event. Thank you.